So it's a little bit later in the day, and I think you've now been entertained, so I think you may be a little bit relaxed, and now we're going to get into a little bit more serious stuff about relieving tension for caregivers. And I think you all want to relieve tension, right? The agenda for this presentation is we're going to explore tension, talk to you about the coping tool for working through tension, the process of working through tension, the coping regimen, and closing the juggling act of tension relief and balance. So what is tension? Tension is very similar to stress. In the work that I do introduce people to, as I had said in the morning, a new perspective and a different language. I prefer the word tension to stress because tension is a description, where stress is often a diagnosis. It's considered like a symptom. You know, if you go to the doctor may say, well, you're suffering from stress. But by using the word tension, I like using it because it's descriptive. You're feeling tense. It's more specific. So what are the effects of tension? Especially when we're talking about caregivers. Immobilizes you, confuses your judgment and decision making. It blocks your ability to cope, and it's a risk to your well-being. So I think we would all agree that tension is not that great. And so what words would you use as the opposite to tension? What's the opposite? Relaxed. Anything else that comes to mind? Serene. Sounds good, eh? So we're aiming for that. I use the word calm. We can accomplish a lot more when I find I can accomplish a lot more and function better when I'm calm as opposed to when I'm tense or when I'm serene. I can accomplish more when I feel relaxed. So how do we relieve tension? We ourselves can self-monitor by using the 3A approach that I developed. When you're tense or you're faced with challenges, they often loss is accompanied with it. That's a basic principle of using this approach called the 3A approach. And the components being acknowledge, assess, assist. It was originally devised as a grief processing tool. And when I say grief processing, it was devised specifically for caregivers, but not in death circumstances. So the work I do with grief is not death related. Usually people, when you say grief, you think death. It's not at all. And the 3A approach came out in 2006. So over the years, it's been developed more and more to be a general coping tool. And it's a doing thing. So you're acknowledging, assessing, assisting at the same time. You assist by self-acknowledgement. self-assessment. And with a strapped healthcare system with limited resources, especially for family caregivers, because usually the healthcare system is focusing on the person who is ill, where does that leave you as the family caregiver? It leaves you to be empowered to take care of yourself and not diagnose yourself, because diagnosis, again, I'm very careful with the language I use. It's more looking at what's happening in my life and how am I reacting and how can I cope with it calmly with the least amount of, in other words, relieve the tension, which is optimum. So, like I said, the first principle of this approach is that where there is challenges from adversity, there is situational loss. A situational loss is the loss of a person, thing, or quality resulting from alteration of a life situation, including changes related to illness, body image, environment, and death. So we're not only looking at what's been lost, but what caused the loss, what changed in your circumstances that created the loss. In other words, you have to look at the context. You have to look at where it's coming from. And there are different types of losses that caregivers experience. For example, in the case of dementia, where a family member has Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so the first loss is the primary loss being the illness. And then there are subsequent losses stemming from the illness, such as roles changing, loss of freedom, loss of time. So that's an abstract loss. And a big loss is the loss of future plans or the loss of ideal. In German, there is a word for that, but in English there isn't. It's Sehnsucht. It's like things that you expected to happen or wanted to happen, and they don't happen. Parents of daughters and sons with schizophrenia, they never expected that this was going to happen to their son. So it's a loss of future plans, loss of ideal. Okay? Then there's multiple losses. That's another kind of loss where you are not only dealing with the loss due to illness, but you may have another family member that's ill. So you have another loss that you're dealing with, or maybe a job loss or financial loss. So there's multiple losses that can happen. So from the context, there's a reaction to what. Okay, so you look at your situation specifically, and you may want to look at this, what I call emotional whirlwind, because that's why people are so overwhelmed, because they are experiencing a gamut of emotions. And it is an advantage to you in relieving tension to acknowledge what you are feeling. And that can be difficult for people who repress, who do not, are not in touch with what they are feeling. So the advantage is to be in touch, to face what you are feeling. And you see that the prominent emotions, there's prominent emotions of fear, guilt, worry, frustration, There could be anger. And we spoke earlier about loneliness. That's also prominent as well. So if you go through the whole gamut of emotions, there may be some that you're not experiencing at all. And there may be some that are really, really, you're feeling very strongly. And it's good to talk about it. It's good to express it and not bury it and hide it and repress it, because it's not good for your health. So when we're experiencing loss, due to death, people grieve, right? There's rituals, people, give condolences to other people. But for caregivers who have experienced a loss, not due to death, but due to illness, there's what we call disenfranchised grief. And Kenneth Doka devised this term, disenfranchised grief, as a reaction to a loss that is not socially sanctioned, openly acknowledged, or publicly mourned. So, and that is what many caregivers experience when you're dealing with ongoing illness and progressive illness. In death, the loss is permanent, but in illness, you're facing the loss constantly. So, of course, that's going to impact. So this is the process of situational loss. You have the initial loss that I spoke about and the subsequent losses, and then there's the reaction. And what you can do is go into your doctor with reaction, but get, maybe prescribed some medication, or you get treated for those reactions of not being able to sleep, not eating well, not sleeping well, crying all the time, feeling sad, low mood, all these things. And if you've noticed, I was very, very specific. So when I talk about reaction, it's similar to symptoms, but reaction means there's a reason. There's a reason for that reaction. And consequently, it can be relieving to know I am feeling this way because of what I'm going through. It's almost, I'm doing quotation marks, normal. So you're normalizing what you're going through. And from there, you have to cope, right? So we have to have coping strategies. We have to know how to deal with the context, with the situation that's going to alleviate and make you feel better, rather than, snowballing and getting more and more tense. The objective is calm coping. Calm coping. So this is what happened. Okay. This is what happened in 3 years with Mrs. G. So let me explain. Mrs. G is a fictional character. She's in a presentation that I do, and it's called 3 Years with Mrs. G, where I'm describing the approach, right, and situational loss. And we go through 3 years with Mrs. G, and this is the chart of what happens with Mrs. G. On the vertical side is the coping, is high or low, and in the horizontal is the losses over 3 years. And it shows, you can see 17 losses. So she's coping at the beginning, you see the line. She's coping in the middle. She's not coping badly, and she's not coping extremely well. We're just kind of seeing a comparison over time. So it starts off, she's with the diagnosis, and then you see a dip in her coping. This is Mr. G has dementia, and Mr. G, I should mention right away that Mrs. G is not a real character. She's a fictional character. She is a collection of different caregivers that I have come across, and colleagues of mine have attested that this is like almost typical of the time frame. And 3 years, sometimes it goes over 6 years or whatever, depending on how long you've been caregiving, but there's a dip. And in this scenario, the dip happened when Mr. G lost his driver's license. And Mrs. G got loss of freedom. She had to end up, now she's chauffeuring Mr. G around. And the reality of the illness is hitting. So there's a little bit of a dip. Then you recover a little bit, and then another, time goes on, and then there's something else, some other crisis that occurs that causes problems. And as time goes on and there's different losses, loss due to loss of incontinence, even though it's Mr. G was incontinent, it impacts Mrs. G, okay? And then moving into long-term care, another loss of having Mr. G in the home. So just to prove a point here is that if we do not take care of ourselves early and emphasize what's been really talked about a lot today, self-care, then and do it as early as possible, it can get more and more difficult as time goes on and end up in burnout. And burnout is not pretty. It's not pretty. And you become non-functional. In this case, Mrs. G ended up having a mild heart attack. And so often it affects it can affect the family caregiver's health. So it is really wise to take care of yourself. And because as caregivers, you're nurturers. You're used to taking care of others. I've been speaking to people here, and I have found that people have brought things back about the person they're caring for, because that's what family caregivers think of first. If the person with the illness is stable, the caregiver is stable. If the person with the illness is unstable, the family caregiver is not stable. So talking to your point about earlier today about boundaries, was it you that mentioned it? Somebody mentioned it over here, about boundaries between the caregiver and the person with the illness, is that there has to be a line in the sand, because you are not the person with the illness. In other words, you gotta break off the enmeshment of that you are the person with the illness. You're not. And you can often lose touch with yourself. So that boundary has to be there. It's essential that there is a boundary between you and the person with the illness. And that will relieve your tension, because you have needs, right? You want to have some pleasure. You deserve it. So the earlier the better. I don't know, some of you I know there is a couple of you here in the latter stage of the illness with your family member, but if you're in the early stage, take care of yourself early and prepare ahead. Somebody was here that came over to me and said, it's so important you didn't mention about planning. And yes, be in the know and in the now. Marlene said be in the now. Very important. So there's that balance. We say caregiver balance. Be in the now, but be prepared for what's to come. So it's a juggling act. Oh, what a segue. It's a juggling act, right? So the coping regimen that I provide in my book, Keeping It Together, I had it at the back. I hope some of you managed to take a look at the book. It's based on the coping regimen that has 3 sections. One is responsible caregiving, linking to resources, education, not being resistant to getting help, all those things that you've probably heard over and over again, right? But practicing it is the key, and that's why there's practice exercises in the book, so you can practice. It's hands-on, it's empowering you. And then there's self-care, okay? Self-care also is something you've heard of again and again and again. You know why you're hearing it again and again and again? Because it's important. It's vital. It's not a luxury for caregivers to take care of themselves. If it's not a luxury, what is it? Necessity. So acknowledge, assess, assist can help you as a self-monitoring tool to relieve tension, because it's a means of being in touch with yourself and knowing what is happening. And you are assisting by acknowledging and assessing, because sometimes just acknowledging and assessing it can provide relief, just by doing that and knowing what's happening. But you got to take it a step further. What am I going to do about it? You can recognize that you're lonely. But if you're not going to take action or do anything to connect or to help you out of the loneliness, then it's not going to, it doesn't help, right? So you have to be your own best friend. So there's a 4th A as well, which in my first book, Kenneth Joka, who devised disenfranchised grief that I talked about earlier, he wrote the foreword to my first book. And he introduced a 4th A. Can anybody guess what the 4th A would be?
Application?
No.
No? Okay.
Sorry. But it's okay, you don't have to be right. But I'd like to know what you would think is the 4th A. Accept. Yeah, I like accept, but that's not what his was. Attitude, good words, but I'm going to tell you, the 3 of them were not it. Allow. In other words, don't be your own worst enemy. Allow yourself to help yourself. Okay? Allow it. And so, consequently, in my second book, I really ran with allow. And I'm now calling it Joka's 4th A. It's not mine, but I like it. So allow. Allow yourself to share. Be open. Be open to change. Be open to the truth. Don't fool yourself, because you're only fooling yourself. And allow yourself to release rather than holding it in. Release. Release for relief. So then we have acknowledge, assess, assist. So you acknowledge, you assess, and say, people always ask me, so what do I do? What's going to help? Tell me what to do. Assist, assist, assist. What do you do? Okay. You grieve. The only cure for grief is to grieve. So in circumstances of death, there are grief counselors that help out, and there are grief strategies that are specifically grief strategies. And these grief strategies can also work in these situations. But being real and feeling the pain, that's why a lot of people go for a quick fix, because they don't want to feel the pain, the emotional pain, right? It's painful. But being true to yourself, a lot of times I hear, well, if I let go and emotionally let go, I'm not going to recover. Like, it's just, I'm going to spill over, I'm going to cry forever. Well, I haven't heard of anybody crying forever, okay? So being honest with yourself. You don't have to be honest with everybody on the planet, but be honest with yourself. Respect rituals. Okay, respect, I'm going into both of them. Nobody reacts. Okay, let's talk about, let's leave grief, because you might not even like that word, okay? Their reactions, how you're reacting, is different for everybody, and different for everybody in the family or anybody that's close, and you have to respect that. Somebody might not want to go to a support group, where another person wants to donate a lot of money to the cause or volunteer, or some people, don't want to be social, where other people do. And it's a fine line, because you have to be comfortable when you're not feeling well, because you're not feeling well, right? If you're reacting to something that's making you unhappy, or it's difficult for you, and be kind to yourself. Okay, so respectful of yourself and respectful of others. Rituals. When there's a death, there are rituals, right? There may be visitation, there's a funeral, and that's very helpful. Rituals are very helpful to move along after a loss. But when you have a loss that's meeting you in the face every day, right? You have different losses that you're dealing with. Well, I'll give you an example of a ritual in situation where there was a family member that was not well. There was financial loss, and consequently, they had to downsize and sell their home. This was a couple. The husband had dementia, and the wife is the caregiver. And so they had to downsize and move out of their home so they can, get cash to live. So they were very sad, because their family, you can get attached to a home. It's the loss of a thing, right? Moving out of your home. She was quite emotional about leaving the home. And so what they did was they had a ritual. The family came over and had dinner, and they talked about living in the home, and they kind of were saying goodbye to the home. So you have to be creative in making up rituals. So what can help? if I was going through what you're going through, and I mentioned that in the morning session, normalize your circumstances. I mean, what you're going through is difficult. If you have a family member who's a wanderer, or a family member who needs help with bathing and toileting and has falls frequently and isn't sleeping at night, if I was going through that, I'd be feeling very similar. So you have to look at, is this, quotation marks, normal for what I am going through? And there can be relief from that, from normalizing your circumstance. Look at the context of where that reaction or where what you are feeling and how you are behaving, your behavior has to do with the context of what you're living with. Okay, next, energize. Energize. See with 3 E's. See it through in comfort. Okay, so this is a lot about self-care. So with the coping regimen, it's a balancing act. You have them, subsequently, you also bring in the self-care. Exercise, the E of exercise, the E of eating, okay? S, sleeping. Okay, what would the third E be? Anybody can guess? We didn't bat 1,000 the last time, but can you guess what the third E could be? Okay, so there's exercise, there's eating, there's sleeping. What else? Is there anything else that you could do in comfort or to make you more comfortable in your situation? What?
Enjoy.
Bang on. How did you get that? That was good.
I was going to say escape.
That's in my book launch. I have escape in my book launch. Yeah, you're getting ahead of yourself here. But escape is not a good strategy because you have a responsibility, right? Easy for me to stand up here and say that. But enjoy. I was guest facilitating at a support group, and I felt really bad when I heard one of the daughters whose mother was just moved into a long-term care home. She said, I wanted to play with my dog when I got home, but I just couldn't even smile. The idea of my mom. And so I said, it's important for you to smile. And it's important. It's part of grieving. You have to counter the grief with joy. You have to. You have to have enjoyable moments or enjoyable days and really enjoy it. It's not like enjoying where you're fake enjoying, where you come back from a lunch with a good friend and you say, I enjoyed that. But instead of, going through the motions, it's authentic enjoyment, right? Authentic. Get real. And then, okay, so that was good. You got it. Okay, feel it through. And I got 3 E's for feeling it. Like really, don't suppress, don't repress, because one day you're just going to explode if you're feeling that, all those overwhelming emotions. So E is express, express, express. Express truthfully. Let your feelings out. Talk about it. Express through journaling. that's really big in grief counseling, is to journal. Mary taught me a great expression that I think the most faded pencil is more powerful than the strongest memory. Did I get it right, Mary? I did. So we went to look up the origin, and it's a Chinese proverb. I'm sorry it didn't come directly from Mary's dad, but she learned it from her dad, which makes it special. And writing things down is very, very powerful. First of all, you can look back on it, right? So express through journaling, through writing. And just being honest, expressing real, do not suppress, and express in writing. And express verbally. Just express yourself. Don't hide. Feel it through, because that's what working through difficult situations is about. Get support. Maintain balance. Juggling. Just keep juggling. Acknowledge, assess, assist. Keep those words in mind, because those are the verbs. They're verbs, actually. They're action words for you. And the assist, really, is anything that's going to help you. Anything. So if there's any, do we have time for questions? Any comments, questions? Yes?
I'm going back to where you said allow.
Yeah?
You said to, don't fool yourself. What happens if the other person, if one you're caring for is in denial? Do you let them fool themselves, or do you say anything?
It's hard to control another person, probably, as you know. Like, if you're dealing with dementia, for example.
Well, no, not so much. No denial of things are, they're getting on, and things are going to be more difficult. That's okay. If they don't want to look at that.
The person that's ill, or another family member. Okay, so you have an aging parent, let's say, and they're not slowing down. They're doing things that are hurt. They're not preparing. It is difficult. Sometimes you have to speak to a professional. That it often the help will not come from you directly, but can come from somebody they respect. Like the older generation often respect their doctors, for instance, or anybody. If there's a family member that they went to for advice a lot, then that can be helpful. That can be helpful. But when you're getting into a tug of war with your family member, let go. Because you won't win. You won't win. In other words, if you get into arguments and you get into, you might even provoke that family member, depending on the illness, into aggression. So you got to be careful sometimes, depending on what the illness, especially when you're talking about dementia or brain injury of some sort, schizophrenia. You have to sometimes work around the person rather than directly with the person. Because really, if you have compassion not only for yourself, but for the person with the illness, they may be having a very hard time facing the it's respect. That's what the respect comes in. They may be seeing the loss unconsciously or in some way, but their means of coping is it isn't happening, right? And that's not really healthy, but it's you can't control another person, but you can respect them, you can be compassionate, and work around them. Any other questions?
What I found helped, because I had a parent like that, was to tell myself that I'll cope when it happens. Like, when something bad happens, I'll cope with it, rather than trying to cope with it ahead of time and pushing them in a direction where I think they should be going. And then doing research, so that when they were ready, then I had stuff to show them and to tell them.
That's like working around them, right? Like you do your research, you get all the information together. You got a plan. You have a plan. Calm is the operative word. What is going to make me calm? What is going to calm me?
Because I had something bad happen, now I'm freaked out.
Yeah.
Because it was not planned or expected, and then I was the one who was holding the ball. I want to prepare, I know you can't prepare for everything, but I don't want to leave with nothing either, you know?
Yeah. And you know what? In the back of my book, there is a quote by Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor who, you saw the quote? Pardon? Oh, Man's Search for Meaning. Yeah. Well, he says that if you can't change a situation, you have to change yourself. So, and what that means is your attitude, your way of dealing with the situation that is uncontrollable. And changing yourself is part of the acknowledge, assess, assist, is really knowing what's happening and being on top of yourself. Because really the only person you really can control is you. So that's, that helps. And it's whatever helps. Yes?
Could you talk about ritual again? I'm very sorry, while you were addressing it, I was tuned out writing notes, and so if you wouldn't mind either repeating or...
Okay, well, ritual is like in death, there are rituals, right? There's funerals, there's sending condolences, there's very common rituals. But in situations of disenfranchised grief where people don't recognize the loss and you don't get, oh, I'm sorry for your loss when you have a family member who's progressing in a major illness. You just don't get that. So you can have to be creative and create your own rituals. And I gave the example of a family who had to move out of their home, and they created a ritual of having a goodbye dinner with the family, and they talked about the house and the memories of being in the house and saying goodbye to the house, because we grieve not only people, we grieve things too, and ideas and qualities. So you really get where I'm coming from. Yeah. I hope you all get where I'm coming from. But anyways, I think I'm rolling. I'm rolling means I'm wrapping up. And I've had the pleasure of spending time with you, and I hope it's been helpful. And on Saturday, I'm launching my new book in Markham. So if anybody's interested, there'll be a presentation with family caregivers. Mary's going to be there, and a book signing. So, and the book's on my website as well as on Amazon.